And point number 24 says, the day of the Lord happened in John's time. The day of the Lord, the Lord's day, happened in John's time. On our text for that point are Revelation 1:10, Malachi 4:5, Matthew 17:12 to 13, Matthew 3 verse 7, Joel 2 verse 28 to 31, Luke 21:20 to 24, 32 and 34, 1 Thessalonians 5:2 to 4. All right? So let us go to our Bible and we look at our main point for this, our main scripture for this point, Revelation 1:10. It says there, I, that is John, the Apostle John, was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet. And in our previous point, we established that this Lord's day, or this day of the Lord, was not a day of the week. It's not Saturday, it's not Sunday, nor was it any 24-hour period, but it was a time of judgment, which historically the Jewish people, the Hebrew people understood that days of the Lord were days of judgment, and one was coming upon Jerusalem in John's time. It is worthy of note that the Old Testament prophets, along with John the Baptist, along with Jesus, and along with the apostles, they all indicated that the Lord's Day would occur, or that the final Lord's Day for Israel, let me put it that way, would occur in the time of the last generation of Israel. That same generation to whom Jesus was sent to, and that same generation to whom the apostles were ministering. In other words, that generation who lived in John's time. For example, Malachi the prophet, let's go to Malachi chapter 4 verse 5. Malachi chapter 4 verse 5. It says there, Malachi wrote, behold, I will send you, the Lord will send you. Who is the you? Well, let's see. Let's go back to verse 4. Remember the law of my servant Moses, the statutes and rules that I commanded him at Horeb for all Israel. So the you there are all Israel who were keeping the Mosaic covenant, right? Israel under the covenant of Moses, or the Sinai covenant, right? So that was to whom God would send Elijah the prophet, who we will see is really John the Baptist manifest, right? But anyway, so he says, behold, I will send to you all covenant Israel, Elijah the prophet, before the great and awesome day of the Lord. Right? So the day of the Lord was to come in the time of old covenant Israel. The day of the Lord that John the Baptist preached about. Right? And why would I say John the Baptist? Because let's go to Matthew chapter 17. Matthew chapter 17, verse 12. Or matter of fact, let's read from verse 10. Let's read from verse 10 for more context. And the disciples asked him, that is Jesus. The disciples asked Jesus, then why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come? Because of what Malachi said. Okay? Malachi said Elijah must come. Jesus answered, Elijah does come and he will restore all things. But I tell you that Elijah has already come. That is something like what we are saying today. Jesus has already come. Same problem. Israel did not have a spiritual mindset. Right? So they were looking for a literal Elijah. Okay? But Jesus said to them, Elijah has already come, and they did not what? recognize him. Same thing like today. Christ has already come, and the modern church did not recognize, has not recognized, and refused to recognize him. But they did to him whatever they pleased, so also the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of what? John the Baptist. So John the Baptist was Elijah, the manifestation or the fulfillment of Elijah the prophet. And Elijah the prophet was to come in the time of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, the great and the awesome day of the Lord. So the day of the Lord that John the Baptist would be preaching about would be the day of the Lord that Malachi talked about. Right? Because if we go back to Malachi 4, I will send you, let's plug in here. I will send you John the Baptist before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. Did he mean I will send John the Baptist 2,000 plus years before the day of the Lord? Well, maybe, but when we consider this word here, before, this word before actually is the Hebrew word ponim. Right? See it there? Ponim. It means in the face of. Right? In the face of. Right? So in the face or in the presence of. That does not give the impression of a distance, a great distance away. Right? So from the time you see John the Baptist or the Elijah the prophet show up, know that the day of the Lord will soon follow on. That's what that word ponim is giving the imagery, that the day of the Lord was that the Elijah the prophet would come in the face or in the presence of the day of the Lord. The great and awesome day of the Lord. Right? So John the Baptist was therefore, his ministry was therefore to be a sign of the nearness of the day of the Lord. The Lord's day. And he, John the Baptist, preached that God's wrath was near and it was about to be poured out. Look at Matthew chapter 3 verse 7. Matthew chapter 3 verse 7. Look at John the Baptist's message. But when he, and that's John the Baptist, when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to his baptism, he said to them, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come?" Now, this wrath that was coming would come in the time where the Pharisees would attempt to flee from it. So it was coming in the time of the Pharisees. All right? As a matter of fact, if you look at this word in, let me see if I put it in one of these other translations, the Berean Literal Bible, for example. It says, "Who warned you to flee from the coming wrath?" All right? That's not so clear. In the Concordant Literal Version, it says, "the impending," the impending indignation. Right? So it was impending. It was at their door. That's what the word impending means. Right? It was not a day of the Lord or a judgment or a destruction that was 2,000 years away. If it was 2,000 years away, make no sense John even mentioning it to the people of his time, because they would not be able to do anything about that. Right? So that judgment, that day of the Lord that John the Baptist was preaching about was the day of the Lord that Malachi was talking about, the day of the Lord which would come when Elijah the prophet was sent. And Elijah the prophet, according to Jesus Christ, was fulfilled in the ministry of John the Baptist. And when the ministry of John the Baptist began, it was a sign that the day of the Lord was impending. Right? So remember, in point number 23, I mentioned that in Joel chapter 2, there are 2 days of the Lord mentioned. In verse 1, there was the day of the Lord which was coming, or which came to Jerusalem on the first temple, the Solomon temple. But then in verse 28, he speaks now about a last days day of the Lord. Okay, so let's go back there. Joel chapter 2, verse 28. Joel chapter 2, verse 28. He speaks about another day of the Lord. So the day of the Lord was not something unique to Jesus's prophetic teachings. The day of the Lord was throughout the history of Israel. They had days of the Lord. So Joel said, and it shall come to pass afterward. This word afterward, let me show it to you. In your lexicon, it says the hind part, right? So it's the hind part, the hind end, or the last part. Okay? In Acts chapter 2, Peter interprets this as in the last days, right? In the last part of Israel. Let's go back to our Bible. So it shall come to pass in the last part, that's the last part of Israel, the last part of the Sinai covenant, that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Well, when did this happen? This happened in the year 31. That would have been 630 years after this prophecy was made. Right? So indeed, it was in the last part. Okay? I will pour out my spirit. Your sons and daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams. Your young men shall see visions. This is exactly what Peter quoted on the day of Pentecost. And look what would follow on from that outpouring of the Spirit. The sun shall be turned to darkness, the moon to blood, before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. So we have John the Baptist's ministry appearing in fulfillment of Elijah the prophet, who was, according to Malachi 4:5, to show up before or in the face of the great and awesome day of the Lord. Now we have the Holy Spirit would be poured out to be followed by the great and awesome day of the Lord. Right? And that was supposed to happen in the hind part or the last part of Israel's days. And in Malachi, the day of the Lord was to come to those people who are keeping the law of Moses. Right? So therefore, this day of the Lord that the apostles and Jesus Christ were teaching about, and Malachi was teaching about, and Joel was prophesying about, is not a day of the Lord that we are to look forward for in our time nor in our future. It was a day of the Lord that would and did happen in the time of John. And that day of the Lord culminated ultimately in the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem, the second temple, which was the Zerubbabel temple, which was also called Herod's temple, and the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, and the destruction of Israel, and the destruction of its people. Right? So, let's look at Luke chapter 21. So this idea that the modern church is scaring people with, It's a fantasy, right? It's a fear-mongering tactic. Jesus said in Luke, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know its desolation had come near. This is the day of the Lord had come to Jerusalem. Because the day of the Lord, as we saw historically, was implemented by enemy armies. Right? Happened that way to Babylon, happened that way to First Temple Jerusalem, happened to the northern kingdom of Israel. Now it would happen to Jerusalem in the time of John. And this was what Jesus was predicting here. When you, and who is the you? The you is not us. The you was the disciples living at that time. They would see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, and then they would know that its desolation had come near. He says, then let those who are where? In Judea, not in France and America and Europe and Asia. In Judea, right? Flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter it. For these are the days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written. Alas for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days, for there will be great distress upon the earth, and wrath against this people. Who's that? Who's the this people? The people of Jerusalem. The people who were inside the city. The people who were in the land of Judea. Right? But you see, when you're reading something and your mind has been programmed to think that this is speaking about our time and we are to look forward for this, then you ignore all of that. You ignore Judea, you ignore Jerusalem, you ignore this people, you ignore this generation, and you make all of it apply to us in the 21st century. That's not good exegesis. That's twisting the scripture. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and where? Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. That was the day of the Lord that Jesus was speaking about. Look at verse 32. Christ again says, truly I say to you, this generation, well, after all mentioning Jerusalem, this people, Judea, surrounding the city, now when he says this generation, would he mean a generation 2,000 years later? Would he all of a sudden jump out of context and start speaking about some other generation? And even so, he said it was this, meaning the generation to whom he was speaking to. Again, we fail to realize that Jesus was speaking to living, breathing people sitting there, standing there, listening to him. So when he said this generation, they understood him to be speaking about them. Right? This generation will not pass away until all has taken place. That's why similarly he said in Matthew 16, he says, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see me coming on the clouds, which is the same day of the Lord. He came. Coming on the clouds means coming in judgment. Right? And then verse 34 says, but watch yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and cares of this life, and that day, that day come upon you suddenly like a trap. What day is that? The day of the Lord. Everything he said there are elements and were elements of day of the Lord. When you read Isaiah, same thing, enemy armies coming up. You read Hosea, enemy armies coming up. You read Joel, enemy armies coming up. All of these things were elements of the day of the Lord. Right? So that day in Luke 21:34 is the day of the Lord. Okay? So after Jesus had spoken to his disciples concerning the signs leading up to the destruction of the temple, the second temple, the Zerubbabel temple, the Herod's temple, he said to them that they should be watchful so that the day does not come on them unawares or to trap them. That day is the same day that John the Baptist, aka Elijah the prophet, was preaching of. The wrath that was to come. Okay? And then Paul, in line with what Jesus said, in line with what John the Baptist said, in line with what Malachi said, in line with what Joel said to the Thessalonians in 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 2, Paul, preaching to the Thessalonians in his time, said, for you yourselves, who are you yourselves? The Thessalonians. He says they were fully aware that what? The day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. Right? Well, if it came to the Thessalonians like a thief in the night, it means they had fallen asleep. And then the day would come as a trap to them, which was what Jesus said they should not allow to happen. Okay? So while people are saying there is peace and security, these would be people in Paul's time. People in the Thessalonians' time were saying there is peace and security. Then sudden destruction will come upon them, the people in John's time, the people in Thessalonians' time. Right? He says, but you, Thessalonians, are not in darkness, brothers, for that day to surprise you like a thief. So notice, the day was coming in the time of the Thessalonians. The day of the Lord. The fact that there was a chance that it could surprise them like a thief means it was coming in their time. But because they were of the day, it means that they had light from the gospel and the teachings of the apostles, right? They had light from Christ. Therefore, the day would not come as a thief to them. But it was coming to them. It was coming to reward them, right? Because a thief doesn't come to reward, right? The bridegroom comes to reward, right? So the day would come to them like a bridegroom, but to those who were unprepared, it would come like a thief, right? It will come to kill, to steal, and to destroy, right? So, the great and awesome day of the Lord, and some translations have the great and dreadful day of the Lord, was coming in the time of John. All right? There is absolutely nothing in the writings of the apostles, there is absolutely nothing in the teachings of Christ that could give the slightest impression that the day of the Lord that they were speaking of is in our future, 2,000 years later. And the Revelation chapter 1 indicated that John had been kept alive to see the arrival of this day of the Lord in fulfillment of the writings of Malachi, in fulfillment of the writings of Joel, in fulfillment of the teachings of John the Baptist, in fulfillment of the teachings of Christ, and in fulfillment of the teachings of the apostles. He and some who were standing there listening to Jesus would witness it. And as with all the other events in the vision of the revelation, the Lord's day would and did come to pass in John's time.